Bon matin à tous et à toutes. C'est un plaisir d'être avec vous ce matin et j'aime beaucoup le thème de la conférence de cette année. Une économie plus verte, une économie plus juste. On behalf of the Fonds de recherche du Québec, I'm pleased to participate at this session of the 27th Conférence de Montréal. But let me begin with a few words on an amazing story, the vaccine against COVID-19. In just about 1 year, multiple vaccines against the COVID virus and its variant were developed. What an amazing scientific story based on open science and global collaboration. Usually, to develop a vaccine may take up to 10 years and more. We are still waiting for a vaccine against AIDS. For me, the success of the science behind the development of vaccine, it's a little bit like a man on the moon project. Certainly, the story about development of vaccine against COVID will be part of textbook for years to come. However, we must not forget that mRNA vaccines were rapidly developed because of global collaboration between public and private sector, and thanks to decades of public investment in the science of mRNA. Without this long-term investment in excellence in basic research, it will not have happened. Now, we must make sure that vaccines are available to everyone, everywhere in the world. We are lucky here in Quebec and in Canada to have access to large quantity of vaccine. At the global level, this is the exception rather than the rule. We must change that if we want to get rid of this pandemic. Vaccines should be seen as common good for everyone. At the same time, the pandemic has revealed to us all in Quebec and in Canada that we must be better prepared to face global challenge, such as pandemics, there will be more to come, and climate change, of course. We must make sure that we can produce locally key equipment and medication, ranging from vaccine to medicine to mask to respirator. Certainly, this has been a wake-up call for our government. Scientists in academia and industry responded quickly to the challenge, and government demonstrated agility. We must not lose that flexibility, agility in the new post-normal world. But at the same time, we must make sure that we are able to act to protect not only our fellow citizens, but also citizens living in less favored countries. Challenges are global, solution must also be global. I certainly applaud the investment in research and innovation made by the Quebec and Canadian government since the beginning of the pandemic. A few examples: investment in Medicago and development of vaccine in Quebec City, increased capacity production of various medicine, equipment of all type. That's great. At the FRQ, we have also started various programs, like a network of scientists working on the COVID-19 virus. Also, the impact of the pandemic on children, on kids that go to school, the long-term impact on kids. So all of that is great, and we use the basic principle of open science to make rapid progress. Now we need to make sure that results from these research, results from these innovation will have positive impact, not only locally, but will benefit everyone, everywhere. I really think that it is our duty to make sure that access to vaccine, access to medicine, access to medical equipment will be available globally all over the world and offered to all citizens of the world. As I said, the world is small and major challenges are global. Solution must be global. Thank you very much.
Challenges are global and the solutions must be global. What a moving introduction. Thank you. My name is Riley Griffin, and I am a New York-based healthcare reporter with Bloomberg News who covers the pharmaceutical industry. And I am honored to be joining you this very morning virtually for the Conference of Montreal. This morning, we will be hearing from three incredibly impressive panelists, each of whom serves quite a different role in combating COVID-19. Before us, we have Thomas Quenney, Director General of International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations. We also have Santiago Cornejo, a director at the Office of the COVAX facility, who splits his time at Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. And we have Dr. Joanne Liu, a professor of pandemic and health emergencies at McGill School of Population and Global Health. Thank you all for joining us today. You know, in order to kick off our discussion, I want to ask the three panelists to dive a bit deeper into their work. I'll begin with you, Thomas. If you will, set the scene for us. Where were you when the World Health Organization declared a state of pandemic last year? And how has COVID-19 changed the role that you serve within your line of work, representing pharmaceutical companies around the world?
Thank you very much, Riley. It's an honor and pleasure, actually, to be on this panel on this important topic. The only regret I have is that I can't be in the beautiful city of Montreal, where I'm longing to go back to, in particular since I am French-speaking as a Swiss. But when you look at the pandemic, I was in Geneva. And about 2 weeks earlier, I had my last intercontinental travel to Tokyo to talk about antimicrobial resistance, exactly at the time when you had the Diamond Princess issue in Tokyo, where the passengers were kept on the cruise ship and couldn't leave it. When you look at what happened, I think in the industry, we were really sensitive. This is business not as usual. This requires a strong response from the industry because very early on we saw since 1918-19 the Spanish flu. This is the biggest threat to global health, global public health, and it's a global threat. This is not Ebola, which hits a few countries in Africa. It's not Zika or not. It's not SARS, but it is something which hit particularly hard in the Western world, in Europe, in the US, and in Latin America. Therefore, the industry committed from the beginning to collaboration, to partnership, to business not as usual. And Rémi Quirón has said, when you look at what happened in May, June last year, when I talked to experts from WHO, the leading expert on vaccination said, if we are lucky, we'll have a vaccine in June 21. You know, many people, in particular in the Western world, have been vaccinated starting in November, December last year. Therefore, the speedy development, in particular of the mRNA vaccine, was record-breaking, unprecedented. The fastest before was the vaccine against Ebola, which took 4 years. Second, when you look at the need, since COVID-19 is such a global threat, pre-COVID-19 global vaccine capacity manufacturing was 3 billion. I've heard last week from the CEO of Pfizer, Albert Bourla, the Pfizer vaccine capacity pre-COVID for all their vaccines was 200 million doses a year. This year, they expect to come up with 3 billion. This year, the industry overall, including Chinese manufacturers, will manufacture 12 billion doses. Therefore, really not just the speed, the scaling up, but also the effectiveness of the vaccine. WHO and others ask for 50% effectiveness, similar to flu. The mRNA vaccines, at least early on, had 95% vaccine. The real challenge, I think, is was not just the scaling up, the trebling of global vaccine capacity, but also the equity. Rémi Quirón called the vaccine as a global a common good, a global public good. Now, the challenge is, I'm an economist, something which is rivalrous is not a public good, because you need to make trade-offs, you need to make choices. And what we, of course, saw, and that goes for Canadian leaders as well as for political leaders in the US and in Europe, politicians, primary concern is about the people who will elect them. Therefore, what we saw, that the countries who had the money, they gave precedence and preference to bilateral procurement. And one of the handicaps of COVAX, and we are partner of COVAX, was early on COVAX was lacking money. COVAX was hoping that non-mRNA vaccine, easier to use logistically, would make it. And by the time COVAX had the money, most of the doses were already committed. That's why the industry actually earlier this year came up with a 5-step plan, an appeal to political leaders to start dose sharing, a commitment to continue optimizing production, an appeal to political leaders to stop trade barriers. And although I think the Defense Production Act from the US is no longer as bad as it was, but right now COVAX initially was expecting 50% of their supplies for the developing countries coming out of India. Since April, nothing has come out of India, and we don't know whether anything will come out of India before the end of this year. Fourth, countries need to be ready to absorb these vaccines, in particular with the challenges of ultra-cold change, with concerns about vaccine hesitancies in countries where people don't quite trust their political leaders. And last but not least, companies need to continue to invest in innovation, to invest in the variants. And the good news there is that all the existing vaccines seem to work quite well against Delta. And I'm sure we will talk about boosters and the like during the panel discussion. Back to you, Riley.
Wonderful. Thank you. You mentioned COVAX here. Let's turn to Santiago. Santiago, you can speak on behalf of COVID with the COVAX with us today. What are your memories of the day the WHO declared a state of pandemic and what followed? Share with the audience a little bit about the formation of COVAX and your role with the facility.
Thank you, Riley, and also it's an honor to be here and with this panel, also to share this panel. Yes, I remember I was just coming from Egypt, because in Gavi, we were looking at what could be the potential role of Gavi in middle-income countries. That Gavi mainly focused on helping introducing vaccines in low-income countries and low-income and lower middle-income settings. So we were coming back, and very quickly, we were looking at what would be the role of a vaccine as a solution. But as it was mentioned at the beginning of this panel, we realized very, very quickly that a global problem requires a global solution. And that's why we couldn't only focus on the countries that we are used to working, which is only the low-income setting countries. So very quickly, I started working on defining who should be part, in what capacity, how we can get a collective action and a collective response. And there in a few months, we were able to, with all of our partners, WHO, UNICEF, the World Bank, industry, civil society, construct the COVAX facility. We lost some months. We lost precious months in terms of being prepared and offering a solution. So it was quite hectic. Then the following months, getting countries to join. We have over 190 countries that joined this effort. That tells you, again, the importance of equity, because that was the solution. What we were proposing and what we are proposing is equitable access to COVID vaccine, which we knew because of past experience that will be a challenge in a pandemic context. So I have to say we have done quite a lot of work. Then we were able to fundraise $10 billion, which again shows the support of many high-income countries. $10 billion fundraised to fund the delivery and the fund on the vaccines for low-income countries. And now, since then, I think Thomas has highlighted, we have distributed over 270 million doses in over 140 countries. Now, this is not enough. We are not, and we are behind, and I'm very sure we are going to go into the details of what do we need in terms to achieve equity, because we are not there yet. In COVAX, we still have a goal, and we hope to deliver at least 1.4 billion doses by the end of the year, which most of them, 1.2, will go to low-income countries. This will help us to vaccinate 20% of the population or 40% of the adult population, which is what we need. We really need to ensure that those populations at risk will receive vaccines. But we have lost momentum. We have, as I said, we're not reaching the countries that as many doses that we would have loved to be at this stage. And this is what we all need to work together. So it has been quite hectic to your question, and long days and a lot of coffee, I always have to say, since the start of the pandemic.
I'm sure everybody on this panel can relate to a lot of days and a lot of coffee. Dr. Joanne Liu, you wear many hats. Just the other day, we spoke after you had finished a shift in the emergency department treating dozens of children. You also recently started a new program at McGill. Where were you when the WHO declared a state of pandemic, and how did COVID change how you see your own role in the care and education of patients?
Good day, everybody, and thank you very much, Riley, for this introduction. And good day as well to my co-panelists. A very an honor to be with you today. Where was I? I think that I don't really remember the day that the pandemic was declared, but what I do remember is when there was, I would say, suspicion there was human-to-human transmission. And when this happened, I remember telling myself, this is going to be different, and we need to gear up. And as one of the co-panelists has said, we have lost a few months, a few weeks at the beginning, where basically when there were those rumors, and then finally the public health emergency of international concern was declared at the end of January 2020. For the month of February, for most of the country across the world, it was a lost month. Most of the countries sat on their hands, nothing happened. They were in a sort of wait and see, I would say, mode, wondering, will it get my way? Will I'm going to get hit by that? And this is where I got very, very concerned, because I was part of basically the frontline response with Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, with Ebola in West Africa and as well in DRC. And I've been on so many numerous commission and lesson learned panel, and we knew that very, very little had been put on board. But one of the things that was, taken on board was basically coming together in terms of our blueprint for R&D and coming together to agree that we need to share as things are going in terms of science, in terms of discovery, when something like a new emerging infectious disease can happen. And it did happen with COVID-19. And I think it's probably one of the silver lining of what happened. I think what has been less successful is how. So basically, what is the silver lining is science saved the day. What is the less, I would say, glamorous side of what happened is the human being. Us as human didn't make it happen in terms of our governance, in terms of coming together, in terms of enacting a global solidarity, and then making sure that everybody will respond and we have the capacity to respond to COVID-19 cases in their region, in their country, and then give and treat people with dignity and as well protect them. This did not happen. And so I think that we have a lot of challenge, but we learn as well that, we're still learning today, that for some reason, one of the key principles I've learned throughout my lifetime of tackling pandemic for 25 years is the principle of precaution. So when you know that something can cause harm, like a human-to-human transmission, you need to be right away in I would say, reactive mode, prepare for the worst-case scenario, and really move away from wishful thinking. Things that many countries didn't do, and many countries end up doing more denying, wait and see, and distrust of the science. And I'm sure we're going to come to that later on. But I guess as a start, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. In the race to end the pandemic, it is certainly the vaccine against COVID and its variants. And as you mentioned, though the virus knows no borders, many government-run vaccination campaigns take place within such bounds. Distribution has been lopsided. The least wealthy 52 countries in the world house more than 20% of the world's population, and nonetheless have just access to a fraction of that supply of vaccines. So I want to discuss how we got here, the consequences, and of course, what can be done to close the gap between wealthy nations and low and middle income countries. Santiago, perhaps let's start with you. Collaborative entities like the COVAX facility have cropped up as these global risk sharing mechanisms to procure and distribute vaccines more equitably. You talked about that missed month, but what else have been COVAX's challenges in getting access to doses quickly and efficiently? And how much visibility do you have into how doses are queued by pharmaceutical companies?
Thank you, Ralia. And first, also, I also want to reinforce the message that one of the incredible outcomes that we have seen is the power of science. We have seen the development of vaccines, something that has never been done so quickly, which is incredible. But we lost months in terms of we didn't the mechanisms for a global response, so we have to develop one while we were already in a pandemic. That also a few countries that have basically at the beginning reserve all the vaccines beyond their needs for their early doses. So what we have seen the major bottlenecks have been the restrictions on exports, not only of vaccines, but also of the raw materials that they require for the vaccines. And now this, as Thomas mentioned, this has affected quite heavily, particularly in India. India has been affected very badly by the pandemic. So for the first time, we're seeing no export of vaccines from India, which is one of the main largest manufacturers of vaccines. So that has been. Then the second challenge has been the challenge in the scaling up of production. And again, we knew that this was a new vaccine, new production line will have to be developed. However, we're seeing some delays. And that delays, they are not affecting equally to everyone. We're seeing delays in some manufacturers that particularly affecting COVAX, while the few supplies that they are able to produce are being prioritized for certain countries. And then finally is we have seen that as much as I said, that the industry has been incredible in developing these new technologies. We're still seeing some delays in terms of the new vaccines coming, and that has affected us in terms of our ability to bring these new products. What are we doing, or what we all need to do? Because we all need to work together. This is not a COVAX issue. This is all working together. We are making a plea for governments, for manufacturers, to make the supply more transparent. As you mentioned, Riley, we need to understand where are the places in the queue, so then we know when vaccines will be available. Also, we are asking to prioritize, to give us places in that list in order for us to provide vaccine to those countries that you mentioned are falling behind. We still have only 2% of the population in low-income countries that have been vaccinated with one dose, 2%. This is unacceptable. And then also what we need, and we are asking, is for governments to accelerate the donations and also to make it more systematized. We know we have countries, and we are starting to see, it has been incredible, the increase in donations from countries, but we need to have it more systematized, and we need to speed up that process. So we really need to catch up. We have lost several months, and I think with all parties working together, we can achieve it, but we all need to work together, and we need to start prioritizing equity in the decision making.
And Santiago, as you have made that plea for more transparency, have you had any kind of response from industry or from governments to showcase behind closed doors how those agreements have been clinched or who is first in the queue?
Yeah, and I think this is something that we all need to work together, and this is what we are looking at. Last week we made this announcement of our latest forecast, where we're seeing still something we're not achieving the targets that we will want to achieve, and this is the plea that we have asked. The good news is we are working together with Thomas and others, and this is exactly what we all need to work together. And I really we all make a call for this transparency and for this really prioritization of equity. We need to, the previous speaker has mentioned, this is not, we cannot save a nation, we cannot save a geography, a region. The only way we can stop this pandemic is if we provide access to vaccine to the world.
Absolutely. Joanne, many have called on high-income countries to redistribute and donate vaccines that they have on hand to low and middle-income countries still lacking that supply or who appear to be running out of that supply in due course. Tell me a little bit about this model and whether or not you feel that it's sustainable as we prepare for future pandemics as well.
Thank you very much for the question. I think the model of donation is a model that works somehow, and we can see the difficulty as highlighted by Santiago, because it is basically relying on goodwill of nation, and does it fit their agenda and the political agenda or not? And so this is why I've been advocating, and then the independent panel for pandemic preparedness and response that I was sitting on to evaluate the response of WHO and its member state that presented his report at the World Health Assembly was pretty clear on that. In fact, of saying COVAX, has been a great endeavor, but needs to be, I would say, optimized in terms of platform. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to move away from the charity model for the model of what I call a little bit, philanthropic capitalisms, where we don't move the things, we leave monopoly with industry. We need to make sure that we create a global common good, a good that is accessible to everybody, that is scalable, and it's in fact doable. And so, and it's not only, and a lot of people I know are pushing back on temporary waiver on intellectual property because they say it won't deliver right now. And somehow it is true. On the other hand, we need to start somewhere. And it's not about just tweaking part of the chain of production, but it's basically fixing the whole chain. And it means that it's like baking a cake. Sorry for the simplistic analogy, but basically, if you want to bake a cake, you cannot only have the baker, you cannot only have the recipe, but you need the baker, you need the recipe, you need the oven, you need the kitchen, you need the know-how, you need the ingredient, and you need good ingredient. That's what makes a good cake. And we want to make good vaccines for everybody. So it's about enacting the concept of a end-to-end R&D with process, creating a real common public good.
Thomas, bringing you in here, you recently held a biopharma CEO event that hit many of these subjects, including what Joanne just mentioned about the ingredients, the raw materials, diversified production. One thing that was brought up with this very rich data from Airfinity was that this very month, Airfinity is projecting that 500 million doses from Western countries may be available for redistribution. But a lot hangs in the balance of booster campaigns. How do you think pharmaceutical companies are going to juggle the needs of countries still seeking enough supply to vaccinate their entire population with those of nations like the United States, the UK, which appear to be moving forward with booster campaigns in the near term?
Now, basically, the decision on boosters is a decision for regulators and for politicians. This is not a decision for companies. I think the good news, and you did refer to this rich data source of Airfinity, and we have worked over the last 12 months, a lot, not just with Airfinity, but also with the companies, and made sure that Gavi and COVAX has these data, because these data are crucially important in terms of making political decisions. And the gist of what you see now, we are moving from severe shortage to really close to sufficient supply to most likely sometime next year oversupply, because by mid next year, I expect we will reach 24 billion doses manufactured. And even if you look at, the booster for parts of the population, I'm not sure that 24 billion doses are really needed. Therefore, there will be companies who will not be able to sell it. Having said that, I do agree and share the concern Dr. Liu said, precaution is important. We need to have a discussion early on. For example, international health regulations, the only binding international legislative arm for WHO, they disallow travel bans. And that's what WHO did early on, in line with the international health regulations. When you look at it now, last month or even 2 months, we traveled too much early on in the pandemic. The second one is really, I hope we see a rebirth of multilateralism. We have seen, and COVAX, I think, is really something which shows an inclusive collective effort. When I look into the real world issues, and I did mention, if I'm not mistaken, Canada has an election soon, and I'm, half joking. Political leaders who want to be re-elected need to show that they care for their citizens. Therefore, I think the issue of the booster shots, and you see it in the UK, you see it in the US, is one where I feel more comfortable if it's not presented as a trade-off between donating for COVAX. You can do both if boosters are needed. Question mark when and how they are needed and for whom. But going back to when we were last May, June in the COVAX, I'm still impressed by the policy allocation principles presented by Kate O'Brien from WHO, which was we should agree that 1% of the world population, the frontline healthcare workers, deserve early access, early vaccination. 12% of the global population, when you look at it at the global level, would be vulnerable, the elderly, above 65. That's why I'm a little bit, on the one hand, I really regret I never saw follow-up. There was a lot of talk about just 24 vaccines getting to one African country. And when you dig a little bit deeper, it was the president and his army generals, which is not quite the frontline healthcare workers. I think we really should be serious about these policy allocation principles. And I'm a bit apprehensive, for example, now with this big goal, 70% of the global population. In Africa, more than 40% of the population are under the age of 15. Therefore, to make a global target of vaccinating 70% of the world, including children, where maybe the risk of vaccination might outweigh the benefits, we really need to have evidence-based discussion. And I think we need to work together. One remark, since Jean-Luc did mention the IP waiver, honestly, companies acted unprecedented collaboration. We have seen almost 300 partnerships. We have seen technology transfer. All of this on the basis of a system which gave companies the confidence they can choose who is competent to provide quality vaccines. They picked partners in Africa. They picked partners in India. But you can take away the recipe for the cake. But if you want to have the expert, Mary Baker, in the UK, Mary the Baker, you need to convince her that she voluntarily shares it with her. You can't really coerce that. And that's why I think, by and large, we were well advised so far to rely on the innovation model, which has given us so many vaccines so fast. And bear in mind that 3 of the leading global manufacturers pre-COVID-19, having tried to come up with a vaccine, so far have not come up with a vaccine. And we are lucky that we have one of the fourth one managed and scaled up enormously fast. We have biotech companies nobody really knew before have come up. And we also have new players, for example, from China or India. Therefore, we have seen the innovation model working at its best, but we have also seen the risks of failure, and in treatments even more than in vaccines.
Such an expansive field of pharmaceutical stakeholders working on these solutions. One I think of, Pfizer, is nearing bringing forth pediatric vaccine data within the month on that 5 to 12-year-olds cohort. You just mentioned children. I want to bring in Joanne because Dr. Liu is a pediatric emergency medicine physician. Joanne, as some countries move forward with vaccinating the youth, how pressing do you believe immunizing children is nowadays in light of COVID? And what are your learnings from the ER?
What is my learning from the ER? I've been doing a stretch of calls over the last few days, and basically our ERs are slammed. And they are slammed with patients with upper respiratory tract infection. And what is fascinating is what we are seeing right now is kids with upper respiratory tract infection from the usual winter virus, from RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, from parainfluenza, from influenza. It's there. And it's basically jamming every single ER right now in Montreal. And so the fourth wave, anyway, here in the northern hemisphere of America is basically winter virus that are coming much, much, much earlier. Because basically what we are seeing is children who haven't been socializing for the last 12 to 18 months and or less than 2 years have no immunity to any of those winter virus. And so right now, with reconvening, those upper respiratory tract infection virus are spreading, and then there's a high community transmission. And this is our reality. The fourth wave would be possibly COVID-19, but would be a lot of the other viruses that is basically slamming emergency room, and then basically putting on their knee healthcare system right now.
You know, as we think about immunizing children, re-immunizing the elderly, the vulnerable healthcare workers with those booster shots, Santiago, I want to bring you into the conversation as well. You know, Thomas had said that COVAX can do both. It can simultaneously donate doses while governments move forward with these next stages of their vaccination campaigns. How do you see the two fitting together, and have these efforts posed you any issues?
Yes, no, and I think first, I think I am in agreement. I think what the most important is, as Thomas mentioned, science, regulatory, they should guide decision making. That's the most important element. Now, when we look at the question, our concern is, again, is that if countries start vaccinating, giving large portions in the short term of boosters at this moment, we will continue to have these shortages, and we will continue to fall behind in those countries that need the most. So as that science said, it's already, as the previous speaker mentioned, shows that the current vaccines work. They prevent death and hospitalization with the 2-dose regimens. And that's why we need to prioritize. We still have countries that have not vaccinated their high-risk populations. So we need to prioritize those countries, those populations. Once we have reached once those countries are able to really vaccinate their high-risk populations, then we will have a greater ability to start revaccinating. As Thomas mentioned, we agree with him. When you look at our forecast, next year we're going to see significant volumes. I think it will be a different situation. But at this moment, when we still have countries that have not vaccinated the high-risk population with the 2-dose regimens that we know it works to prevent hospitalizations and death, that should be our focus.
The three of you have addressed, the efficacy of the vaccines, who should be getting vaccines and where and at what pace. One thing I want to address, and I think is often missed in the discussion, is how people get the vaccines, how they are distributed and administered. And Dr. Liu, as the former president of Doctors Without Borders, you know very firsthand about the challenges of administering these vaccines on the ground. Once countries do have COVID-19 vaccine supply in hand, what challenges do they face in terms of distribution, whether it's those cold chain requirements or even vaccine hesitancy? And how do global leaders need to improve upon their on-the-ground efforts?
Right. At country level, and in some of my co-panelists has already alluded, there's a lot of challenges. It's one thing to make a promise of sending millions of vaccine to a specific country. It's another thing to bring the vaccine to the tarmac of an airport. But one of the biggest challenge that we don't talk about it, and when you look at every single dashboard, it doesn't give as much operational visibility, is what is a journey of vaccine from the tarmac of an airport to the arms of a beneficiary. And that is a huge challenge as well. And then this is why, as Santiago has said, we need transparency and we need advanced planning. Country, especially LMIC, and we've seen it here, in Canada, is when we started our campaign, it was a big deal. And it took us several weeks to make it happen. And now it goes, things go well, but we put massive amount of money, massive amount of resources. So basically, it's advanced planning is key because people can get prepared. We know that sometimes, the cost of vaccine might represent a fraction of the cost of bringing a vaccine from the tarmac of an airport to people's arms, in terms of resources, in terms of cold chains, in terms of hiring the staff who's going to do it, in terms of communication and education to prepare the community who's going to get it. So it is important that there's no vaccine dumping. Don't send from high-income country with no I would say upstream, announcement of shipment of vaccine with short shelf life. We know that it takes several weeks to move around vaccine. And so if you send a short life only a few weeks, the chances are that countries might have to be faced to destroy those vaccines. We've seen it already. There's more than 450,000 vaccines has been destroyed in Africa, and a little bit more than that, I think, over the month of, that was as of July, but I think there's more in the month of August. We know this country who received it said, you know what, I won't be able to handle it, like Sudan, and then they hand it over to Kenya. Malawi have destroyed vaccine. So those scenarios needs to be, those precious vaccine need to get in people's arms. And we have to make everything we can to make it happen, to advanced planning, to announcing in advance, to as well support with resources the journey of vaccine from tarmac of the airport to people's arms.
Thomas, a lot of the pharmaceutical companies are working to extend the shelf life of vaccines or improve upon those cold chain issues. Are you excited about second generation COVID vaccines? Are there any particular ones we should be watching? How are you thinking through what a vaccine looks like in 2022?
I think, to be honest, for the time being, I'm excited about the first generation vaccines. And we have seen failures in second generation vaccines. I've had a media briefing for the UN press corps in Geneva earlier this year, and I had one of the best experts from CEPI with me who said, I never believed that this year's vaccine capacity would be beyond 5.5 billion. And when I asked him why, he said, I never expected that the mRNA vaccines would work. Because people have dreamed about mRNA, oncology products, about vaccines for 25 years. And there was public support, but there was even more private money going into, in particular, in the oncology field. And here they delivered, and I think I see many people are so grateful. But I really agree with what Dr. Liu said. We also need to make sure that the country readiness to absorption is there. One of the best books I read this year was Heidi Larsson's Stock. It requires a lot of time and efforts to overcome vaccine hesitancy, the concerns. You need to involve the municipalities, the local people. You need the nurses. You need this infrastructure. And what we noticed earlier this year is that, many people thought it's about procurement and the cost is procurement. It is really also about the infrastructure. And that's why I'm very pleased to see, again, praise for multilateralism, how the World Bank under David Malpass IMF under Georgieva, WTO with Dr. Ngozi and Dr. Tedros have come together, and the banks, of course, and regional banks and countries need to commit money for this infrastructure setting, because one of the concerns which we have seen, it is about vaccine hesitancy and countries refusing vaccine, but the other one is also about you can get donations, and if they are too short to expiry of shelf life, you will see countries pushing back for understandable reason. Now, again, shelf life is a moving target, and I would expect that we will see data on stability, as with any other medicine, which will allow you to use a vaccine for longer, but we need to rely on science. I wrote last year an op-ed, when some politicians in some countries were trying to interfere with the speed of vaccine approval, we as an industry came out very firmly. It's science and regulators who need to make these decisions. And regulators, I think, so far have done amazing work 24/7. And I wouldn't fault WHO or any of the leading national regulatory agencies. They've really put patients first and put science above speed.
Let's stay on infrastructure for a moment, because that's a wonderful point. The WTO, the WHO, among others, as you mentioned, have sounded the alarm on the concentration of coronavirus vaccine and treatment production facilities in North America, Europe, Southeast Asia predominantly. So how do you see the diversification of manufacturing fitting into this question of equity, and how quickly can we get some of this infrastructure put in place, Thomas?
Maybe I can have a go. I'm involved, for example, in the German roundtable on vaccine manufacturing in Africa. I was earlier this year at the Vaccine Manufacturing Summit. I think everybody realized relatively early on, Africa and Latin America, by and large, have no manufacturing capacity. Therefore, I think there's a genuine agreement that one needs to diversify. And we have seen it in Europe. Europe has been concerned about antibiotics, the raw materials, and the active ingredients, by and large, coming out of China and nowhere else, where people were nervous. Therefore, I think there's a broad consensus that one needs to work on. John Nkengasong, the amazing lead of the African CDC, expressed the target of 60% local vaccine manufacturing by 2040. I think in the current pandemic, you will see the occasional collaboration on fill and finish, like with Aspen and Johnson & Johnson, like the recent announcement of BioVac, the Europharma in Brazil with Pfizer-BioNTech. And we have seen a lot of this. But what really makes a difference in terms of scaling up with the large collaborations, like with SK Biotech in Korea, with Serum Institute in India. That's why the Indian export ban is so dramatic, because it's not only impacts AstraZeneca vaccines, but also Novavax. And we have also seen how, many of us would have hoped Novavax would have been available in July, because it is a different technology platform. And there you see the regulatory challenges, the scaling up of a company which didn't have any manufacturing capacity until 15 months ago. But I think and believe we will see much more collaboration, partnerships, but it's happened on a voluntary basis, based on trust. An Indian colleague of mine from one of the big Indian Bharat, he said, we do tech transfer. We have a checklist of 70 criteria, KPIs, which our tech transfer partners need to fulfill. All of them are about quality assurance, good manufacturing practice. And if not, we will not sign a contract with them.
Santiago, do you think that the diversification of manufacturing facilities could ease some of the supply gaps that you mentioned earlier? And, to Thomas's point about the export restrictions, particularly out of India, would having more facilities in different regions around the world continue leading to further export restrictions or mitigate that risk?
Thank you. I think in the short term, because as Thomas mentioned, I think it's not the solution. It takes time to build vaccine manufacturing, to really build that production. So it will take time. Now, I think it's clear that what we need, and this pandemic show, is more diversification, and that will require a true tech transfer, an end-to-end tech transfer. And because we need to also realize that vaccine manufacture is extremely complex. It's not a simple process. It requires several components. We have 50,000 individual production, 70 quality control. So it is a process that requires the know-how, as it was mentioned by Dr. Liu, and also the technology. And that's why we need to start building that transfer. We need to build that capacity worldwide. But in order to do it, also it's very important that it has to be done in a sustainable manner. This is a long immersion. The examples that Thomas mentioned, Serum Institute of India, if you look at Brazil, if you look at Indonesia, these have been long-standing vaccine manufacturing, or Korea. That's why what we need is to have a longer-term vision of diversification, investment in vaccine manufacturing beyond the crisis of today, in order to be prepared for the future. That's what it will really help us to build this network that will allow us in the future to be better prepared.
Joanne, as a pandemic preparedness expert yourself, already thinking about how to make these sustainable facilities into the future, what do you think we can do today in terms of investment or diversification to ensure that these facilities have longevity to them and can do this work, say, to combat a different novel pathogen?
Well, I think that the co-panelists have alluded, to different, I would say, measure that needs to be taken in terms of diversification. And then I think the key word for me is to it's going to be sustainable if it's an accompanied process, and then somehow basically probably is going to need some incentive to happen. And it won't happen overnight. It won't happen because a policy had been made. But it will happen if a company, and I'm really out of my league right now, but my understanding of what's going on, if to do that tech transfer takes several months, and so therefore there needs to be a partnership on a period of time, months to year, to make sure that we reach, I would say, the capacity and the productivity capacity. But I think the point I would like to make is more about how do we conceive R&D. And I think it's a paradigm shift that needs to happen in terms of making sure that low and middle income country has the capacity to do research, because we're talking and we have a huge focus on vaccine. And for this pandemic, vaccine is the key. But maybe for the future, it might be the treatment. We might need a more performing rapid diagnostic test. And so therefore, I think we need to have a mental shift in terms of how do we do R&D and how do we enable and accompany low and middle income country to do research and development, being able to contribute at the different phases of discovery, from the phase 1 with the first human test to after that the big clinical trial. And I think if we do that, because it's a question of creating an ecosystem that can welcome and then can scale up and gear up to do more research and development when an emerging infectious disease happens. And so I just want to make sure that we just have not this sort of tunnel vision of only vaccine manufacturing, but it's much wider. It's about having a mental shift and gearing up differently on R&D and LMIC.
To end where we started, these global problems demand global solutions. I really appreciate the three of your time this morning. What fascinating comments and practical, actionable next steps to take. Really appreciate you making it happen and the work that you all do. And thank you to our audience for joining us this morning. We hope to catch you again soon.